Hi, John.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well. My semester is over. I've graded all my papers, and now I've got another 5 weeks or so of Christmas vacation. Not to gloat, but I'm in a good mood.
Well, that is gloating because I actually have papers yet to grade. Thanks for reminding me. I'm going to get to that today or tomorrow. Let me introduce us, though. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are John Horgan, famous science writer. You've written a number of books, including Rational Mysticism, The Undiscovered Mind. You wrote an anti-war book. What's it called?
The End of War.
Okay, that leads us to your other book, The End of Science, which was written nearly 20 years ago, published in 1996. And in fact, this year, a new edition has come out. Such is the significance of this book that the publisher said, what the hell, if you'll write a foreword for free, we'll put it in and call it a new edition. And they did. Do you have it there to show us?
Here it is. I should say that it wasn't the original publisher. Unbeknownst to me, it had gone out of print. And it was never produced in an e-version. E-books weren't, I'm not sure they were available in 1996.
Not many, no.
Yeah. And so there was a guy at Basic Books, an editor named T.J. Kelleher, who had liked my book and found out that the rights were available and decided to republish it, asked me to write a new preface, and of course I was thrilled.
Basic Books is a very estimable publisher. They publish some great books. I mean, seriously, they're kind of at the nexus of academic and trade books. I was actually an editor at Basic Books. I was the editor of New Republic Books, which was an imprint of Basic Books. So I had my office there, Basic, back when the late Martin Kessler was the editor. The late great Martin Kessler, I really liked him. And I, in the course of 7 months as the editor of New Republic Books, I failed to sign up a single book. At which point my career as a book publisher came to a close, and I moved to the New Republic magazine.
Good move.
And the rest, as they say, is not history. But anyway, they published Robert Axelrod's The Evolution of Cooperation, Frank Sulloway's Sigmund Freud, Biologist of the Mind. Those are books. You know what they published is I think they published Douglas Hofstadter's Pulitzer Prize winning book, Gerd Lescher Bach.
I think you're right, because they also published his more recent book, I Am a Strange Loop, which I happen to have just read within the last couple of months. Mm-hmm. It's kind of Gödel Escher Bach Part 2.
Yeah, word around the publishing house there was that working with him on a book was a full-time job.
Well,
he was very meticulous. That book, remember, Gerd Lescher Bach had like illustrations and so on, and he was very exacting.
He actually wrote about this in his new book, and then I actually called him up. I'm hoping to meet him, interview him sometime soon. And he sees a book not only as a bunch of ideas, but as a potential object of beauty.
Right.
So he takes very seriously even things like the typeface and the layout of the pages and so forth.
Right.
That
was what they said. I had not been there when they were working with him on the publication of that book, but that was what they said. So what we're going to talk about is the end of history. I mean, the end of science, or should history come to an end during this, we will discuss that as well.
Kind of intertwined. And you just Fukuyama.
I just had a conversation with Frank Fukuyama in public about the end of history and other things. So yeah, I'm doing all the ends. I'm covering all the ends. And we're going to discuss and sometimes disagree about your thesis. I think there is something to be said for it, but there will be some argument here, I think. And what is your sense of the public view of your book? I mean, certainly among scientists, for perhaps understandable reasons, a book called The End of Science was not received with universal praise, right?
Yeah, the blowback was really intense. But, obviously everything I'm going to say about this is going to sound very self-serving. I have a very powerful confirmation bias. There was this initial reaction to my book much of which was different versions of "How dare he?" and "Who the hell is this guy anyway? He's not even a real scientist. He's just a journalist, and only has a degree in journalism and English." And he writes for Scientific American. We thought Scientific American was on our side. This kind of reaction. But what was interesting was that many scientists privately, and you're just going to have to take my word on this, told me that they agreed with much of my book. The
part involving disciplines other than their own.
Well, no, because what made the book so difficult for them to deal with was that I was saying, I'm not a postmodernist. I was saying that science has become a victim of its own success. So I'm celebrating the immense achievements of science over the last couple of hundred years. Evolution by natural selection, the Big Bang Theory, quantum mechanics, and relativity, all of which have given us enormous insight into nature and even into ourselves, the history of life on Earth. And I'm saying it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to top those achievements. So, most scientists also reject postmodernism. They don't have any. They don't have any patience for that kind of argument. They think that science is converging on the truth in some way, and I accepted that because I think that it's absolutely true. I think history of science has demonstrated that. Then the question is, what can we do beyond what we've already done? So I was really using the scientists' own arguments in many cases to make my case that science is finite and it might be very close to hitting the wall. And so what some told me privately was that they thought I was onto something, but that it was a very dangerous idea that might hurt science in some way. It might even lead to less funding for science, less public support. And by the way, this was an idea that also cropped up at my own magazine, Scientific American, where I worked as a full-time writer when the book came out. And there were some people at the magazine and the administration who thought that a book like The End of Science was really bad for science as a whole, and more specifically for Scientific American, the magazine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a way I think I would have been tempted to put your thesis that would have led me to defend it wholeheartedly. And I'll save that for later. I'll let the suspense build about exactly how I might have put your thesis. But as you put it, I mean, the title of the book invited, first of all, what I'm sure you would consider misunderstanding. You weren't saying there would be no new scientific discoveries. You were kind of saying, I think, no, there are no whole new vistas that are going to open up the way vistas opened up with quantum physics or relativity or the theory of natural selection.
That's right. I'm talking about the
discovery of DNA you might include as a vista that we will not see the likes of again. I don't know.
Yes, although what's interesting about DNA, the history of biology is quite different than the history of physics. So, you had Newtonian mechanics looking like a really powerful, possibly permanent paradigm for understanding new discoveries in the physical sciences. And then suddenly quantum mechanics and relativity came along, and they were entirely different. They were even, to use the wonky term of philosophers, they even seemed incommensurable. So you had what in some respects was a radically new vision of reality at the beginning of the 20th century, whereas the genetic revolution, the discovery of the double helix and then of the genetic code over the next 10 or 15 years in the 50s and 60s really fit quite nicely into the more broad framework of evolution by natural selection.
Right. And there's really been nothing that did otherwise since. I mean, the theory of natural selection has just turned out to be a pretty good theory. I mean, major thresholds happen. Suddenly we can do genetic engineering and we can see things at a finer and finer level, but it all is compatible with the theory of natural selection. Now, the thing you said about physics suggests, I'm sure you've heard this, a reason you might be wrong. As you said, relativity and quantum physics seemed incommensurable. They still have not been united, right? And there is hope that they might be. And I guess one question is, why do you think they won't? Because you would have to concede, right, that if there is this grand unified theory, or a theory that unified, those two worldviews, which may or may not be the exact same as the kind of classically sought after grand unified theory, you tell me. But in any event, something that reconciled those two under a single theoretical umbrella, you would concede that then you were wrong? Would you concede you were wrong if that happened?
Okay, so I've got many arguments in my book, and then I've got kind of a meta argument. So the meta argument is that science actually figures out how the world works. It gets some things right once and for all. It discovered that all matter is made of atoms, and atoms are made of quarks and electrons and things like that. Natural selection I see as a permanent part of knowledge as well. And then you get to something like physics, and you've got these two different languages for understanding two parts of the world. You've got quantum mechanics, which is basically a theory of the micro realm. General relativity is a theory of the universe and of gravity. And there's been this idea that actually has some merit, that those two ways of understanding reality, which are looking at different things in a way or written in different mathematical languages, should at some point be revealed to be part of some kind of deeper underlying theory. So this is a hope that goes back to Faraday, actually, who originally showed that electricity and magnetism were different aspects of the same force. And then you come up to the 20th century, and Einstein was obsessed with the possibility of showing that gravity and electromagnetism, and then the nuclear forces, when those were discovered, were part of the same underlying force. What's weird about it is that it's kind of an aesthetic goal, as opposed to something that's really driven by problems out there.
Yeah, but it's worked so far, right? I mean, more and more things have been unified, so it is the direction that things have gone in. Although you're right, it's an interesting philosophical assumption. It's almost in certain ways religious in nature, the assumption that there would be a unity underlying it all.
Oh, that's been pointed out many times, that this desire of physicists to have everything come from some kind of primal particle or force seems an awful lot like the religious belief in a single God. So when I'm looking at the state of physics, when I was looking at the state of physics 20 years ago, all I could do is look at the candidates for a unified theory, and judge how plausible they seem to be. And the major candidate back then and still today is something called string theory, which says that the primal particle from which all things come, and even space and time and energy, is this little stringy thing that exists possibly in many more dimensions than the ones we're aware of right here. The problem is, which I've written about ad nauseum at this point, and these problems are well known, that these strings are so small that to gain access to them, to get a kind of direct empirical observation of them, the way that we have of electrons and quarks and things like that, would require a particle accelerator larger than anything that could ever possibly be built, bigger than, according to some estimates, or as big as the entire galaxy. But having said that, let me I'm going back to my previous argument about small arguments and then larger arguments. My meta argument is that science converges on the truth, and once you discover that, then you have to go on to something else. Some of these truths become permanent. But then I've got many arguments about different fields. One is that a unified theory in physics is probably not going to be possible, given what we know now about matter and energy, and given the limits of the resources that we can bring to bear trying to solve those problems. But if somehow a unified theory is discovered and validated, then I'd still say we're reaching the end of science. That will be the end of physics. And by the way, when
so in other words, you're saying there's at most one more step in physics, one more big step, if that, is that what your point?
Right. Although I think if a unified theory is discovered and validated, it could lead to all kinds of new discoveries on top of that. But I don't think such a theory will be validated. But I just want to make the point that it was Stephen Hawking and other prominent physicists who back in the 80s started talking about a final theory of physics, that if a unified theory was discovered and was proven to be correct somehow, maybe just through philosophical and mathematical arguments rather than empirical ones, then that would be the end of physics. So they actually used that phrase, the end of physics, and that was part of what inspired me to start thinking about the end of science. So again, I'm using the arguments of the scientists themselves.
Can you explain one thing to me? So we've been talking about the grand unifying theory as a unification of relativity and quantum physics. It seems like it's more often described as a unification, a final unification of four forces, right? There's like, okay, so like electricity and magnetism were unified in the form of electromagnetic theory, I gather. Then there's like what, the strong nuclear force and the weak, or the big and the small, or something. There's two different nuclear forces.
Right. So the weak nuclear force governs certain kinds of radioactive decay, and it was in the 60s that physicists proposed that electromagnetism and the weak nuclear force are both different aspects of an underlying force. And the theory made various predictions about the kinds of particles that you should expect, and those particles were discovered.
Those are quarks?
No, quarks are what are predicted by quarks mediate the strong nuclear force. It's a force different than the weak nuclear force.
So electromagnetism and the weak nuclear force have been united?
Yes.
And what is the name of that theory?
It's just called electroweak theory. It's part of what's called the Standard Model of Particle Physics, which also encompasses our theory of the strong force. That's the one that involves quarks, and that's sometimes called chromodynamics, something like that, because it's got these properties called color involved.
Okay, so you've got electroweak, which encompasses weak nuclear, electricity, magnetism. You've got strong nuclear. Are those the only? So the final theory would just unify those things. Okay. Is that it? And if so, the question I started off is, how does that map onto the quantum and relativity unification? How does that? You get it.
Okay. Now I have to introduce another potential source of confusion here that I wanted to avoid. There are different levels of unification. One level that has been sought for decades now, unsuccessfully, is called grand unification, and that would just unify the electroweak theory with the theory of the strong force. And
what would it leave out when you say it would just unify that?
It would leave out gravity.
That would leave out gravity.
So remember, gravity is the force that's described by general relativity.
Okay.
That's kind of, gravity is sort of over here, and then you've got the theory, the quantum theory, and general relativity is not a quantum theory. All the quantum theories are applying to electromagnetism and the strong and weak nuclear forces. Right now, the Standard Model of particle physics encompasses the electroweak theory and then the theory of the strong nuclear force, quantum chromodynamics, I think it's called. And then, so that, and
okay, so that's the answer. Relativity maps onto gravity. Quantum physics maps onto all the other forces, which, so So if I'm understanding this, wait, there's in a way two unifications to be done unless you do them in one full sweep. I mean, on the quantum side, there's a unification to be done because strong isn't yet unified with electroweak, right? And then once you did that, you would have to unify that with gravity, which is under the rubric of relativity.
So it's just an interesting historical fact. When I started,
is the answer to that question yes? By the way,
I think I'm answering that.
Okay.
What I'm about to say is that for some reason, it's almost as though the grand unification level has been skipped lately. There used to be a lot of concern with trying to achieve that, and then the hope was once we had the grand unification, then we could do the final unification with the theory of gravity,
right.
And you'd have one theory of all the forces. But what's odd, and I'm not sure exactly why this is the case, is that you don't hear much talk about just a unification of the electroweak theory and quantum chromodynamics anymore. People have just jumped right over that to the total unification of general relativity with all the quantum.
So string theory would, in theory, if it actually worked, it would unify all of them?
Right. And those theories, those are what are sometimes called quantum gravity theories,
right.
Because the assumption is that this means that quantum mechanics would be expanded somehow to encompass gravity, or you'd have a quantized version of general relativity. Yeah, I mean, so that's basically what the hope is. Oh, and so quantum gravity theories of everything, unified theories are all basically different.
Now, so Lee Smolin's, what is it? Quantum loop gravity? What is it? That is an example of a non-string theory unifying theory, is it?
Right, except the problem is my understanding of Smolin's theory is that it's only a quantum theory of gravity. So it's actually not a theory of everything because it leaves out electromagnetism and the weak and strong nuclear forces. So the hope there is that if you can have a quantum theory of gravity,
then presumably gravity would become more commensurable with the other side, the electro-weak stuff, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like, I mean, if you imagine them as different languages, it would be like you've now translated gravity into a language that you can also translate the other languages into in theory or something.
I'm sorry, I got to turn off this goddamn phone.
Oh, there's a Christmas tree behind you. I'm so glad the phone rang so that we can get a little bit into the spirit. Yeah, why don't you give us another shot at that?
Yeah, but can you see my T-shirt?
Yeah, Stop Wars. It's in the Star Wars logo kind of design motif, but it says Stop Wars, which I know is a position of yours. You are against wars, unlike the many people who favor them.
Right.
Nice tree. We can only see the top half.
Thank you.
Looks a little on the artificial side, but hey.
It's actually a real tree.
Is it?
I thought about getting an artificial tree this year because, I don't know, I've been told that
global warming.
It's not cool to slaughter so many Christmas trees for this silly ritual, but I like the way they smell, so I continue to have my trees.
Well, and you can do what Bill Scher does, who, of course, is on the weekly Blogging Heads TV show, the DMZ. He goes out. He lives in, I think, rural Massachusetts. Goes out and to a farm where you cut off yourself the top part of the tree. That becomes your tree, but you leave intact the bottom part of the tree, and it continues to grow.
How do you do that, with like a stepladder or something?
You got me. But
but then you have this weird-looking stumpy tree.
See, this is the kind of attitude that led you to say that science was going to end. You're just kind of cantankerous, and
but
there's
I'm
no pleasing you.
I'm very optimistic about things that really matter, and to be honest, I've decided that unified theories and even theories of consciousness, I mean, I would love to see these achieved in my lifetime, in spite of my argument that I don't think they will be. But what really matters is that life gets better for more of us, that we solve our environmental problems, our problems of social justice and inequality and all those sorts of things. And I think there's no limit to how good things can get in that regard, even though right now, it's hard to be an optimist. I think we're going to get through this very difficult, violent, scary period, and more humans than ever will flourish in the future.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, and that reminds me of something else. I think you're not saying about science. You're not saying that there won't be tremendous scientific progress at the level of applied science. Like, it would be consistent with your theory if we came to understand the brain at a higher and higher level of resolution and came up with more and more pharmaceuticals that cured more and more mental illnesses, or in other ways came up with scientifically based therapies that cured mental illness. Now, I know you're a little bit of a skeptic of a lot of the of pharmaceutical intervention and so on, but that's not an in principle skepticism so much, right? Like tremendous progress along that line would be consistent with your theory. Tremendous progress in information technology or something, space vehicles, blah blah blah. You're not talking about an end of progress at the applied level, right?
No, I'm not. But I end up, so I blog for Scientific American, and a lot of what I write about is in the realm of applied science, which would include medicine, let's say, various technologies. And there is not nearly as much progress in applied science as you might conclude reading popular accounts of science, popular journalism, and even books or even scientific papers by scientists themselves. So, for example, I write a lot about psychiatry, about treatments for mental illness, and I think that psychiatry is really in a primitive state right now. The drugs are not very effective. They harm a lot of people.
You know what I think the big breakthrough will be, and I'm sure you've heard this, and it's a common hope. I think often with drugs, you find, well, they help some people and they don't help others. I wish we could have predicted who it would be, and there is this hope that the answer may lie in the genes, that they'll do a scan of your DNA and go, oh, well, this is the antidepressant you need, and that. Maybe that will. I don't know if you doubt that scenario, but that's one of the big hopes.
It seemed like it would be inevitable. I don't know, 25 years ago. So Scientific American, starting at least in the early 80s, had all these articles about the potential of genetic therapies for inherited diseases. These are diseases where you could actually identify the mutation or set of mutations that was causing this kind of disorder. And the hope was, and it seemed quite plausible, that you could then fix that genetic problem. And we've had 25 years of gene therapy in the meantime. And we've also had the Human Genome Project, which goes back more than 10 years. And gene therapy at this point has been a total bust. It's been an enormous disappointment. What's interesting is that genetics, some of the simple models about how genes lead to various kinds of behavior or diseases has become really complicated, and those complications show up in the difficulty of coming up with genetic therapies. I certainly hope that there will be a payoff of all the genetics research that we've had so far, and of all the new technologies for decoding genes much more rapidly. But so far, it's been an immense disappointment. And that's not just my opinion. It's right there out there in the record of the clinical trials. There are other possibilities. I've written about a technology called optogenetics, which is it's really exciting in some ways. This is only invented about maybe 10 years ago, and it involves tweaking the genes of brain cells so they become sensitive to light, and then you can stick lasers in your brain or light diodes of some kind and stimulate the cells to make them fire or inhibit their firing. And this has led to a lot of excitement. People are talking about a revolution in psychiatry coming from optogenetics, but and there's been a lot of hype about it. But it's an immensely invasive technology, and it's assuming it begins with gene therapy, which, as I just said, has turned out to be very ineffective, and then it also involves sticking a lot of instrumentation in your brain.
There's also the the what is it, the transcranial stuff, the non-invasive, the use of like electromagnetic waves or whatever. There's some findings there, right? I mean, it's still a pretty blunt instrument, but what kinds of things have they shown they can do with that? Well, I mean, I know one you've written about is the supposed inducing of religious experience, but that's not the only thing they're interested in, right?
No, actually, there are a whole bunch of different electric technologies for stimulating the brain for therapeutic uses. I wrote a piece on my blog, I don't know, 3-4 months ago, pointing out that somebody had actually sent me a paper that was published, I don't know, like 120 years ago on the faddishness of electric cures for mental illness. Mm-hmm. And the language was, I mean, it could have been published today. It was filled with all this enthusiasm for all these new devices that were rechanneling the electricity in the brain and so forth. And then I went through all the major different devices that there are for supposedly treating depression and anxiety and other mental illnesses, and showed that the good clinical trials don't show any evidence that they work. The only electric therapy that really does seem to be effective, at least in the short term, is electroconvulsive therapy, otherwise known as shock therapy, which for people who are extremely depressed, suicidally depressed, can provide some short-term relief, although almost everybody relapses over time. Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry to be such a downer, but...
well, you have to admit that you constitutionally are a skeptic, right?
I like to think I'm a realist. I mean, you can see
we all think we're realists because we all see the world and it seems like the real world. But some of us are pessimists, some of us are optimists on the spectrum of relative human, perspective. But
I believe in progress. I'm very hopeful for the future. I think that humans are doing a lot of things right. But I've been a science journalist for more than 30 years now. And I get really annoyed by scientific hype because it's just repeated over and over again. And I've seen some of the same stories.
That's true. I mean, if you've been in the business, I used to be kind of a science journalist a long time ago. I'm really not now. But and if you've been in the business a while, it's like Groundhog Day. It's like, it's just being in science journalism sometimes consists of like just finding a new way to tell the story of quantum physics or something, some like, oh, there's a new paper, and so there's a new author, and I can call the new author and get the quotes, but it's the same old, it's another gee whiz story about how weird quantum physics is, right? I mean, there is this kind of recycling in science journalism, and it's fine. It has pedagogical value because new generations discover these truths, and you have to do it, but I know what makes you jaded. I've been there.
Well, listen, I became a science journalist because I am awestruck by what science has told us about the world and about what it can even reveal about ourselves and our history and all the different theories of how our minds work also fascinate me, even if they aren't necessarily true, which I think you could say is the case with all the current theories that we have of the mind. But there are some theories that have real consequences, where people's lives are at stake and their health, and it's also a question of economics. So there's some scientific claims about medical treatments, for example, that lead people to spend a lot of money on certain pills, let's say, or procedures. I've been writing a lot about cancer recently, and I think one of the biggest stories in science journalism right now is that the whole idea of preventive medicine, let's say, in cancer, or having better and better tests that can detect cancer at an earlier stage so that it can be treated more quickly, or before it's spread, and that's going to lead to better outcomes. All that has been shown to be false. And it now appears that, let's say, if we're talking about mammograms, which in particular I've been focusing on recently, that there are millions of women who have suffered unnecessarily because they have received positive tests from mammograms and have gotten mastectomies and chemotherapy and radiation that they didn't need, where there is tremendous resistance from people in the cancer industry right now to what seems to me to be an overwhelming revelation that cancer testing has turned out to be.
Same with men and prostate cancer.
Absolutely. With prostate cancer, for some reason, I think it became accepted more rapidly that a specific test, the PSA blood test for prostate cancer, was not a good idea, that it led to a massive number of false positives or overdiagnoses. But with mammograms, there's still a lot of battling back and forth. Yeah, and you can imagine why. You've got doctors and radiologists and people who are treating women for cancer and surgeons and so forth, who are being forced to confront the fact that they may have hurt they almost certainly have hurt many more women than they have helped.
Yeah, there are two things that I hope are getting as much attention as they deserve, have gotten more attention lately. One is that a number of doctors have had a financial interest in having various diagnostic things done, tests done, and have a financial interest in doing things like surgery and so on. And you know, they don't have to be like consciously devious and corrupt for that to influence their decisions about how to steer patients. There's that. And then there's the second thing that I'm happy to say has gotten a lot of attention, which is the number of these studies that are funded by companies that have an interest in the outcome, like pharmaceutical companies. And so I hope things will improve on that front. Now, at the more fundamental level of science, kind of where we started out, I think there's a couple of things we should cover. We need to get to the mind-body problem.
Sure.
Before we do that, just to revisit physics a little, I assume that what you would say when somebody says, wait a second, since you wrote The End of Science, the Higgs boson has been discovered. I don't even know what the status is. I assume we still think it's been discovered, but I assume you would say, that just confirms a pre-existing theory, right?
The Higgs boson was predicted in the early '60s, and it is what you might call the capstone of the Standard Model. Mm-hmm. Which again, that's the quantum theory that encompasses the electroweak force and the strong nuclear force. What's weird about it is that it is, in some ways, it's a wonderful achievement, but it's an achievement of old physics. The new physics, or the exciting physics at the frontier, that's string theory and loop space theory. It's these quantum gravity theories, and which have no hope of being validated by any kind of particle detection at the Large Hadron Collider in the way that the Higgs boson was. Those theories, I can't emphasize enough what a discontinuity it is between the level of physics that gave you the Higgs boson and those unified theories, which are dealing in distance scales and energies that are just so far beyond what we can access.
What about this piece recently written by Dennis Overby, whom you and I both saw at dinner not long ago, of New York Times? Did you see this piece where they thought maybe there was evidence of a whole new particle they hadn't anticipated coming out of, I guess, was that the Large Hadron Collider or what?
Yes, it was. Here's
even he qualified it. I mean, he said the chances are this is going to turn out to be noise and not a new particle, but apparently physicists are taking seriously the possibility it's a new particle.
I give it vanishingly little likelihood. I've seen so many of these things come and go, and that was qualified right from the start in so many ways that I give it no chance of being validated in the future. But I will tell you that there was one astonishing discovery in physics made since my book, it's still has the potential to blow things wide open. It just hasn't happened yet, and that's the discovery. Not only that the universe is expanding, that's the basic Big Bang theory, but that the rate of expansion is accelerating. So that was discovered in the late 1990s, several years after my book. And what was wonderful about that is that nobody saw it coming because it's so counterintuitive. The assumption is that the rate of expansion will gradually slow over time because of the force of gravity sort of slowing things down. But that's not the case.
When was that discovered?
It was discovered in the late 1990s, and so it's led to a lot of this speculation that you've probably heard about the possibility of something called dark energy.
Right.
That there is,
which is separate from dark matter.
Yes.
I mean, dark matter almost works the other way around, right? It was like, why isn't the universe expanding faster? There must be this dark matter slowing it down, or is that not? What was the logic behind dark matter?
There are actually a whole bunch of different versions of dark matter, but the basic idea is just that the luminous matter we can see through our telescopes only encompasses a very small fraction of the total mass of the universe. But then you have this stuff called dark energy that also has different properties, supposedly, than ordinary matter. Einstein actually first proposed it. I'm not sure exactly when. I think maybe in the 1920s or so, because he wanted to have a repulsive force counteracting the force of gravity.
Because he thought the universe wasn't expanding at all, right?
Right. He thought that gravity would make everything.
And he considered this a huge blunder. This was the fudge factor he introduced into his equation. And once it turned out the universe was expanding, no fudge factor was needed, and he had needlessly muddied up his own equation.
Right. And this is so typical of Einstein, that something that he perceived himself as one of his greatest mistakes is now a very powerful idea for explaining this very weird result. But one could turn this around against your argument. It seems like it's like, okay, so wait, there's this stuff called dark matter. We think there's stuff called dark energy. What that means is we can't actually detect it, but we infer its existence from other weird stuff that we can't otherwise explain. Now, that might lead someone to conclude, wait, there's a whole lot of stuff yet to discover, because we don't have a clue about a lot of the stuff that's going on. So won't that be a breakthrough? Like if the matter or the energy becomes directly detectable or whatever, couldn't this lead to mind-blowing discoveries? It could. I mean, so it could be like the discovery of, there are all these anomalies that were building up in the late 19th century and early 20th century that people were puzzling over. There was no ether through which light was transmitted. You had the discovery of radioactivity and X-rays and things like that. The photoelectric effect, which didn't make any sense in terms of conventional physics. So all these strange things that were increasingly difficult to fit in the pre-existing paradigms, and it all kind of blew up. And when the pieces settled, you had this whole new framework with relativity and quantum mechanics. So it's possible that you could have something similar to that, and that the acceleration of the universe could be one of those anomalies. This is what a lot of people thought. This is what I thought might happen when it was first discovered. But now it's been more than 15 years, and the acceleration of the universe is just kind of a weird twist of the basic Big Bang paradigm. Mm-hmm. That's how I see it. And the dark energy theory is not really. It's just kind of an idea to explain this bizarre, this bizarre phenomenon. It's sort of like that old joke with "and here a miracle happened." It's an idea that is really a label on something that we don't understand.
So dark energy is inferred from the fact that the expansion of the universe is actually accelerating. Is that right? Right. And dark matter is inferred from what?
Okay, so. Here's where things get complicated. The first version of dark matter was inferred from looking at the rotation rate of galaxies. And the galaxies seem to be rotating in a way that wasn't consistent with the measurements of mass that you get just by adding up all the stars. So the assumption is that there's a lot of unseen matter in there that accounts for the actual rotation rates. But then there are other much more complicated versions of dark matter that you get from looking at the universe as a whole, not just individual galaxies that are more complicated and have to do with the rate of expansion and so forth. Again, dark matter is just kind of, it means that your models aren't coming out perfectly. You have to have fudge factors. Dark energy and dark matter are fudge factors in your models of Big Bang cosmology.
Okay, let's briefly move from science to technology, and let me tell you that you have moved to the periphery of your frame, and you should recenter yourself. There you go. Now, back to science. Let's jump to the mind-body problem, and here I think we're probably largely on the same page. So let me give you my take, and see what you think. I know one thing you say in the book, The End of Science, is the mind-body problem is something we just may never figure out. I agree. One reason I agree is because, first of all, the nature of subjective experience is unlike everything else science studies. I mean, science studies publicly observable phenomena, and that's essential to the workings of science, is that, like, okay, if I can look through an electron microscope and see this piece of DNA or whatever the hell it is, so can you, and then so we can say we agree that the measurement is X, and that kind of agreement is essential to the way science works, because you have to be able to replicate each other's experiments and so on. Now, the thing about my subjective experience is no one can observe it other than me. So first of all, it's just qualitatively different kind of thing, makes you wonder whether there could ever be a scientific theory of it. The second thing that I observe is that, like, you know, you were at this thing I had at Union Theological Seminary, which I thought was a really interesting conversation involving David Chalmers and Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein about the consciousness problem. I thought we did a good job of summing up some of the latest currents of thought. On the other hand, some of the latest currents of thought are some of the oldest currents of thought, and what you're reporting on when you report on mind-body problem is largely like, okay, well, now more and more people are taking what's called panpsychism seriously. Well, that's been around forever, A, and B, the reason they're taking seriously, it doesn't seem to be because of any particular actual experimental finding. It's just like the general puzzlement over the phenomenon leads people to go, well, maybe it is this thing that we discarded 20 years ago, you know? It's like, it's just mystifying, the phenomenon of consciousness, and it's not obviously why, if you have a truly scientific perspective, in other words, you're a scientific materialist, why it should exist at all. You can in theory explain the workings of any organism without reference to subjective experience. So there we are. I'm inclined to think that you're right, that we may never have a clearer fix on it than we have now. There also may be just something about being a conscious being that impedes comprehension of the phenomenon or something. I don't know.
Yeah, by the way, I really like that evening.
Yeah, it's on. It'll soon be on Meaning of Life TV, and I think well worth it. But
because discussions of consciousness can get obscure very quickly, and I thought you guys were about as clear as it gets in talking about consciousness and giving us a sense of what the different theories and philosophies are. But you're right. I mean, so here you had a very prominent philosopher of mind, and Rebecca Goldstein, who certainly knows a lot about current theories of mind and the philosophical debates about the mind-body problem. And it just seems extraordinary to me that they are taking seriously an idea like panpsychism, which says that maybe consciousness imbues everything in the universe. And by the way, going back to dark energy, I was at a conference on something called integrated information theory, which is inspiring a lot of this interest in panpsychism. It's a very wonky, difficult mathematical theory, and its main proponents include some of the top neuroscientists in the world. But one of its implications is that panpsychism is true. And so I love that kind of stuff, because to me I say, come on, that looks like the end of science to me. These are smart people ramming against the wall, a limit of science, and they're coming up with all sorts of crazy ideas. But I might be more optimistic than you are about possible progress in neuroscience and the mind-body problem in the following way. I think that when it comes to understanding the mystery of consciousness, especially given the problems that you just talked about, the inability of us to access each other's consciousness, let alone the consciousness of non-human things. I don't see that as a soluble problem, but I do think we could have an immensely effective theory of how the brain works, so effective that it becomes very predictive, and it allows us to interface, let's say, with electronic devices.
Oh, I can see all that. And I can see a much finer mapping of physiological states to different states of consciousness. But
Right.
that is not really solving the mind-body problem. This is Dan Dennett's confusion. He thinks like, oh, we've got these correlations between brain and subjective experience, so we're done, right? And
But
no,
here's-
we're not done.
But I think that, so the phrase that I like to use is the neural code, which has a lot of assumptions embedded into it. It's
Yeah, I don't get that. I don't know why you'd expect there to be a neural code. As I understand it, although I have to admit my only source for trying to understand is listening to you and George Johnson talk about it on Science Faction every once in a while on Blogging Heads TV. But go ahead.
The basic idea is just, the assumption is that our brains are just these very weird, squishy computers, and that there's some kind of set of algorithms that they're using to generate decisions and perceptions, thoughts of various kinds. And they're all different. There are lots of different versions of the neural code. The assumption is maybe that there are different neural codes used for different parts of human cognition, but there has been some success in figuring out kind of crude neural coding in ways that make it easier to plug prosthetic devices like artificial cochleas into our brains.
But see, even that I just don't think gets at the hard questions about consciousness.
But here's what I'm saying. I would be, if we figured out the neural code to the point where we really could understand brains, and I'd be looking for certain kinds of practical outcomes. We can understand why schizophrenia happens. Let's say why depression happens.
Mm-hmm.
We can understand mental disorders because we understand the information processing in the brain so well. Maybe we would have insights into the problem of free will. It's kind of hard to.
I don't know.
But to me it's at least conceivable. You can the possibility of maybe not the singularity, but singularity type events, humans becoming cyborgs with greatly enhanced intelligence, information processing, enhanced perceptual ability. That's going to be a future that is radically unlike our own.
Yeah, no, I don't rule any of that out. I mean, let me tell you why I'm keep coming back to the mind-body problem per se. I told you at the beginning that there was a way I think I might have wanted to articulate your thesis if I had been writing your book. And it is this. It's that for philosophical purposes, science is over. In other words, if you look at the big philosophical questions, ethical philosophy, mind-body problem, which is, I guess, a subset of epistemology, metaphysics, what is the fundamental nature of stuff, maybe even teleology, is there a larger purpose? I think you could argue that science has definitely given us a lot of relevant information about all of those, but it's not going to give us more. I think you could argue that in the realm of ethical philosophy, Darwinism, as I would say, refined with the theories of like kin, deeper understanding into altruism and so on, I would say that's about as good as it's going to get on that. I would not expect some kind of major theoretical alteration of what we know. I mean, there's some stuff to be worked out between group selectionists and individual selectionists. I don't think that by itself has major implications for ethical theory. I do think the existing body of Darwinian knowledge and evolutionary psychology and so on has great relevance to ethical philosophy, but I don't think we're going to get new stuff. On the question of kind of metaphysics, the nature of stuff, well, we've already gotten to the point where the physical theories just don't make any sense to us. Quantum physics, we can't make any sense of it. I mean, and string theory, again, doesn't make any sense. Oh, there's 10 dimensions? What the hell? I can't imagine that. That doesn't do me any good. And so on. And I think you could at least make the argument that on those major philosophical frontiers, free will, metaphysics, ethical philosophy, mind-body problem, that for reasons we've kind of hinted at during this conversation, you just may well not get any more fundamental input, even if there is a mathematical unification of the physical theories. They just that unified version may not make any more intuitive sense to us than the existing theories make, and already the import of quantum physics for metaphysics is basically, oh man, shit is really weird. And that's as far as it gets us. And so that's the thing I would defend as a reasonable claim, is that for philosophical purposes, science has ended, even if there's a unification in physics.
Well, so what's interesting about that is that the way you posed it, I think I would agree with that, except that when you've talked about this before, I thought you were suggesting that science has reached the point where it can resolve many of our philosophical problems, and where it's quite the opposite. And I think that's what you were just saying, which is that science, it turns out, is actually quite limited in settling once and for all some of the ancient philosophical debates, like which is primary, mind or matter. Panpsychism suggests that maybe mind is just as fundamental as matter. That's one of the implications. Is it a deterministic universe, or do we have do our minds have the ability to influence the course of our bodies and of matter out there in the world? And another ancient philosophical debate, which is still raging.
Or moral realism. Are there moral truths? And you're right. No, I'm not saying science will resolve. I do think science has moved the ball forward. I think we can speak more intelligently about the question of moral realism, by virtue of understanding how our ethical intuitions evolve via natural selection. But no, I don't think by any means that all of these philosophical questions, certainly including free will, mind-body problem, are going to be resolved definitively once and for all.
Well, my working definition of philosophy is that it's the pursuit of questions that have no definitive answers, as opposed to science, which I think in principle is looking at questions that can be answered, at least possibly at some point in the future. So in a way, you could say that maybe we're posed. You've had some of these prominent scientists disparaging philosophy lately and saying we don't need it anymore, when in fact philosophy might be poised for a renewal and a new period of flourishing. I'm fascinated by philosophy because I'm obviously obsessed with the problem of free will. I think that even the question, I'm a pretty hardcore materialist, but I think it's really interesting that some extremely smart people are talking about consciousness as being as fundamental as matter and energy in some way. These are philosophical questions that go back to the ancient Greeks.
I think philosophers are valuable in part to explain to scientists why they're facile answers. Not that all scientists posit facile answers to philosophical problems. And not that I'm going to mention Lawrence Krauss's name now, which I'm not, but it's been known to happen, and it's valuable for philosophers to step in and say, no, this is not the question we were asking, or this is not the interesting question, or this is why this really doesn't settle it once and for all. The other thing I would say is I'm not saying that none of these questions will be answered. free will and determinism, for example, I mean, determinism at least would be intelligible, and I suppose there's a way something could convince us if that's the case. Free will is in a way harder to conceive of, although it's intuitively more appealing. So I'm not saying that we won't. I'm just saying I think it wouldn't surprise me if science was not going to shed any major new light on the basic philosophical questions.
See, when I describe philosophy as dealing with the set of questions that they can't be answered, that might sound as though I'm disparaging philosophy. I think that that's an invaluable function. I think in human history, humans have shown that that they have this tendency to cling to belief systems, whether they are religious or scientific or political, and to think that these are final answers to what we should believe about the universe or how we should conduct ourselves. And often bad things happen when humans develop this kind of certitude. So I think it's essential that we have a counterforce against the certainty that is being foisted on us by scientists, let's say, or even some people in the political realm. And the best philosophers to me are the ones that teach us to be humble and modest in our truth claims, because I think that's actually that attitude is merited by how little we know.
I think that is the irony we can close on because we agree on it, which is that scientific progress is undeniable, and even you concede may, in significant senses, continue for some time to come as far as practical applications go. And yet, ironically, what all of this breathtaking scientific progress has done is in what it should do, I think you and I agree, is instill intellectual humility in us, because it shows us more and more how imponderable these basic questions are. And it gives us more and more reason to believe that science may never shed enough light for us to fathom the basic mysteries.
Right. And I think there are, that kind of doubt should carry over into the social and political realm as well. And that, we'll be better people if we have that kind of humility.
Right. And that's particularly true of the people who disagree with me on political issues, by the way. Listen, thank you. Congratulations on the new edition of The End of Science. I encourage everyone to tune in to you and George Johnson's periodic conversations under the rubric Science Faction on Blogging Heads TV. Available in both streaming video and podcast, like all of these conversations. So have have happy holidays, happy New Year, and so on.
Same to you, Bob.
Okay, thanks.